Northern France, October 1944. The air tasted like burnt powder and wet stone. Corporal James Jimmy Dalton sat cross-legged in the ruins of what used to be a farmhouse, hunched over a rifle that looked like it had been assembled by a half-blind mechanic with a grudge against symmetry. The stock was mismatched wood, darker on one side than the other. The barrel had come from a different rifle entirely, salvaged from a weapon that had taken shrapnel 2 weeks prior. The bolt handle was slightly bent. The trigger guard showed rust spots despite his best efforts, and the front sight post had been fashioned from a bent nail and a sliver of scrap metal he'd found in a bombed-out machine shop. To anyone with even a passing knowledge of firearms, it looked like something a child might build from junkyard scraps. To the men of Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, it was a running joke. Hey, Dalton, that thing gonna blow up in your face or just fall apart when you pull the trigger? Sergeant Bill McKenna called out from across the rubble-strewn courtyard, his voice carrying that particular brand of mockery that soldiers reserve for each other when boredom and exhaustion blur together. A few men chuckled. Someone made a crack about Dalton running a scrapyard instead of carrying a weapon. Another voice chimed in, suggesting he could probably sell it for $5 if he found someone drunk enough or desperate enough to buy it. The nickname stuck immediately. The $5 scrap rifle. Within hours, every man in the platoon was calling it that, and Dalton had stopped trying to explain himself. He didn't bother looking up. His callous fingers moved with precision, tightening a screw here, adjusting tension there, checking the alignment of the makeshift sight he'd mounted using a bracket from a broken pair of binoculars and a spring from a discarded cigarette lighter. The sight wasn't standard issue. Nothing about this rifle was standard issue. But Dalton had spent enough time staring through scopes and iron sights to understand the geometry of aiming, the relationship between eyes, sight, and target. He knew what worked, even if it didn't look like what the manual said it should. Dalton had grown up in the Appalachian Hills of West Virginia, where rifles weren't just tools. They were survival. His father had taught him to shoot before he'd taught him to read properly. And by the time Jimmy was 10, he could drop a running rabbit at 100 yards with a rifle older than his grandfather. Money had been scarce. Ammunition even scarcer. You learned to make every shot count. Learned to fix what broke, because buying new wasn't an option. Learned to improvise when parts wore out or went missing. When his standard-issue M1 Garand had taken a direct hit from a mortar fragment outside St. Lo, most soldiers would have turned it in for a replacement. Dalton had looked at the wreckage, looked at the spare parts lying around a supply depot, and seen possibility instead of loss. The M1 was gone, but its receiver was intact. He'd scavenged a barrel from a rifle whose stock had been shattered beyond repair. The bolt assembly came from another weapon that had suffered a cracked receiver, but had a perfectly good firing mechanism. He'd traded cigarettes for springs, haggled with a mechanic for tools, and spent 3 evenings in a supply tent after dark, piecing together what nobody else thought could be made whole. The result was a rifle that fired, cycled, and held zero. Barely. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't regulation. But it was his, and more importantly, it worked. You gonna take that thing into combat, Dalton? Private Eddie Larson asked, genuine curiosity breaking through the teasing. Larson was 19, fresh-faced despite 2 months in a line, still young enough to think regulations mattered more than results. He stood in the doorway of the farmhouse, helmet crooked on his head, rifle slung over one shoulder in the easy. Careless way men carried weapons when they weren't expecting trouble. Dalton finally looked up, his gray eyes calm and untroubled. That's the plan. But it's not even. Larson started, then stopped, searching for the right word. It's not standard. Standard got blown to pieces, Dalton replied, his voice flat, matter-of-fact. This works. McKenna wandered over, hands shoved in his pockets, a cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth. He was older than most of the squad, 32, with a face that had seen too many firefights and not enough sleep. He'd earned his stripes the hard way, through 3 campaigns and more close calls than he cared to remember. He looked down at Dalton's rifle with the expression of a man trying to decide whether to laugh or confiscate the thing. You're telling me you trust that scrap heap of your life? I trust myself, Dalton said simply. The rifle's just metal and wood. I know how it shoots. I know where it hits. That's all that matters. McKenna took a long drag from a cigarette, exhaled slowly, and shook his head. You're either the smartest guy in this unit or the craziest. Haven't figured out which yet. He turned and walked away, still shaking his head. But there was something in his tone, not quite respect, but not quite mockery either. More like weary acknowledgement that war made people do strange things, and if Dalton wanted to bet his life on a homemade rifle, that was his business. The rest of the platoon didn't share McKenna's measured skepticism. To them, Dalton's rifle was entertainment, a distraction from the grinding misery of the advance. Every time he checked it, adjusted it, or carried it, someone had a comment. They called it the Frankenstein gun, the junkyard special, Dalton's disaster. The jokes were constant, relentless, and mostly good-natured, the way soldiers cope with fear by turning everything into humor. Dalton never argued, never defended himself. He just kept working on the rifle, kept zeroing it during downtime, kept practicing his breathing and trigger control whenever they had a few quiet hours. What his squad mates didn't see, what they couldn't see, was the hours Dalton spent testing that rifle. Every chance he got, he'd slip away to some quiet corner of the rear area, set up improvised targets, and shoot. He'd pace off distances, check his groupings, adjust the sight in tiny increments, and shoot again. He'd test it in rain, in mud, in the cold pre-dawn hours when frost made metal slippery. He'd fired it prone, sitting, kneeling, standing, leaning around corners, braced against walls. He knew exactly how the trigger broke, knew the slight pull to the left at 150 yards, knew the way the barrel heated after 10 rounds and how that changed point of impact. He knew this rifle better than most men knew their own hands. But to Charlie Company, it was still just a joke, the $5 scrap rifle. And Jimmy Dalton was still just a weird hillbilly who couldn't let go of a pile of junk. That afternoon, orders came down. The battalion was moving east, pushing toward a cluster of villages that intelligence said were lightly held. Lightly held was Army code, for we don't really know, but you're going in anyway. The plan was straightforward. Advance under cover of darkness, secure the primary village by dawn, and establish a defensive perimeter before German reinforcements could respond. Standard infantry work. Walk forward. Hope you don't get shot, dig in, repeat. Charlie Company would lead the advance. 3rd Platoon would take point. And Dalton, whether anyone liked it or not, would be carrying his scrap rifle into the night. As dusk settled over the broken landscape, the men of 3rd Platoon gathered their gear in tense silence. The jokes had stopped. They always did before a night operation. Fear had a way of cutting through humor, leaving only the raw awareness that some of them wouldn't see morning. Dalton checked his rifle one final time, running his thumb along the mismatched wood. Feeling the rough spots he hadn't had time to sand smooth, he loaded 8 rounds into the internal magazine, cycled the bolt to chamber the first round, and clicked the safety on. The rifle felt solid in his hands. Familiar, right? McKenna moved down the line, checking weapons, checking men. When he reached Dalton, he paused, glanced at the scrap rifle, and met Dalton's eyes. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then McKenna nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and moved on. It wasn't approval. It wasn't encouragement. It was acknowledgement. You've made your choice. Now live with it. They moved out just after midnight, a long file of shadows slipping through the darkness, boots scraping softly on broken cobblestones, equipment creaking despite every effort to muffle it. The moon was a thin crescent, offering just enough light to see the man in front of you, and nothing more. Dalton moved near the middle of the column, his rifle held low and ready, eyes scanning the black shapes of ruined buildings on either side of the road. The village they were approaching sat 2 miles ahead, nestled in a shallow valley between low hills. Intelligence said it was a supply route. Intelligence said resistance would be light. Intelligence, as usual, was wrong. The first shot cracked out at 02:15 hours, a sharp, unmistakable report that echoed off stone walls and frozen earth. The column froze. Somewhere up ahead, a man gasped and hit the ground. Then the night exploded. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness from a dozen positions, high and low, left and right, scattered across buildings and rooftops in a carefully coordinated ambush. Bullets snapped through the air with that distinct, Vicious crack that meant they were passing close. Too close. Men dug for cover, scrambling behind walls, into ditches, through doorways, anywhere that offered even illusion protection. Snipers. Multiple positions. Someone screamed, voice cracking with adrenaline and terror. More shots followed, methodical and precise. Not the wild spray of panicked troops, but the deliberate fire of trained marksmen who knew exactly what they were doing. Another man went down, clutching his shoulder, dragged into cover by his squad mates. Then another. The advance had turned into a nightmare in seconds. McKenna's voice cut through the chaos, hard and commanding. Get down. Find cover. Return fire. But returning fire at an enemy you couldn't see was a fool's errand. The snipers were hidden, elevated, dug into positions they prepared in advance. Every time someone tried to move, tried to advance or retreat, another shot rang out. The platoon was pinned, trapped in a kill zone with no good options. Dalton had thrown himself behind a low stone wall the moment the shooting started. His heart hammered in his chest, but his hands were steady. He pressed himself flat against the cold stone, rifle tight against his shoulder, and forced his breathing to slow. Panic got you killed. Haste got you killed. What mattered now was reading the battlefield, understanding the geometry of the ambush, finding the shooters before they found you. He listened. Between the scattered return fire from his own unit and the shouts of wounded men, he listened for the distinct crack of sniper rifles. There, high and to the left, maybe 120 yards out, second floor of a gutted building with half its roof missing. The shot had come a fraction of a second after Larson tried to move forward. Dalton marked the position in his mind. Then another shot, this one from the right, lower, maybe ground level, or a basement window. A third shot followed from straight ahead. Higher up, probably a church steeple or tower. They had the platoon surrounded on three sides, overlapping fields of fire. No safe avenue of movement. We're stuck, someone yelled, voice tight with fear. We can't move. They've got us locked down. McKenna was shouting orders, trying to organize suppressive fire, trying to get a squad to flank left. But every attempt was met with immediate, accurate fire. 2 more men were hit. The platoon was bleeding, and if they stayed pinned here much longer, they'd be slaughtered piecemeal. Dalton could hear the desperation in McKenna's voice, the realization that standard tactics weren't working, that they needed something, anything, to break the stalemate. Dalton shifted his position slightly, staying low, and brought his rifle up, the scrap rifle, the joke, the $5 piece of junk that everyone had mocked. He braced the stock against his shoulder, feeling the familiar pressure, the slight looseness in the fit that he'd learned to compensate for. He peered through his homemade sight, a crude but functional piece of improvised optics that gave him just enough magnification and clarity to pick out details in the darkness. The moon was faint, but his eyes had adjusted. He could see shapes, outlines, the faint suggestion of movement. There, second floor, left building, a shadow behind a window frame, barely visible, just the outline of a head and shoulders. The sniper shifted, repositioning for another shot. Dalton exhaled slowly, let his body settle, found the natural pause between breaths where everything goes still. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, not pulling, just touching, waiting for the moment when mind and body and weapon aligned into a single point of focus. The crosshairs of his makeshift sight settled on the shadow. He didn't think, didn't doubt, just squeezed. The rifle barked, recoil punching back into his shoulder, and for a split second, Dalton wondered if the whole thing would come apart in his hands. But it didn't. The bolt cycled smoothly, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round. And across the darkness, 120 yards away, the shadow in the window jerked backward and disappeared. No one noticed. The firefight was too loud, too chaotic. But Dalton had seen. He'd hit. He'd dropped the first sniper. He shifted his aim, scanning for the next position. Ground level, right side, basement window. He'd heard a shot from there 30 seconds ago. He watched, waited, and then saw it, a muzzle flash, brief and bright, followed by the crack of a rifle. The shooter was partially concealed behind a pile of rubble, only his head and rifle visible. Dalton adjusted his aim, compensated for the angle, and fired again. The scrap rifle kicked, the bolt worked, and the sniper in the basement window slumped forward and went still. Still, no one noticed. The platoon was too busy trying not to die. But McKenna, crouched behind a shattered wagon 20 feet away, caught the second shot out of the corner of his eye. He turned, saw Dalton working his rifle with calm, methodical precision, and his expression shifted from confusion to realization. "Dalton, you got eyes on them?" "3 down." Dalton called back, voice flat and focused. "5 more I can see. Give me cover." McKenna didn't hesitate. He started barking orders, directing suppressive fire toward the general positions Dalton had identified, not to hit anything but to keep heads down, to buy Dalton time. The rest of the squad didn't understand what was happening, but they followed orders, pouring fire into the darkness. In that brief window of noise and chaos, Dalton went to work. 3rd target, church steeple, straight ahead, elevated at least 40 feet. The sniper up there had been picking off anyone who tried to advance. Dalton could see the faint outline of the steeple against the slightly lighter sky, could see the darker shape of a man leaning out from the bell tower opening. Long shot, tricky angle. Wind was minimal, but elevation mattered. He adjusted his aim, raising the sight slightly to account for bullet drop, and fired. The rifle cracked. The bolt cycled, and high above, the figure in the steeple jerked and tumbled forward, half falling out of the opening before catching on something inside. 4th target, rooftop sniper, far right, prone position behind a chimney. This one was smart, disciplined, barely moving, only exposing himself for seconds at a time to take a shot. Dalton waited, rifle trained on the spot, breathing slow and even. Patience was the hardest part of shooting. Waiting for the moment instead of forcing it. 10 seconds. 20. Then the sniper shifted, leaning out just enough to line up another shot. Dalton fired. The bullet crossed 140 yards in less than a second and took the sniper in the upper chest. He rolled sideways off the roof and disappeared. 4 down. Now the platoon was noticing. The incoming fire had slackened. Fewer shots, less accurate. Men were looking around, trying to figure out what had changed. Someone shouted that the snipers were pulling back. Someone else said they were all dead. McKenna was staring at Dalton with an expression somewhere between disbelief and awe. "How many?" McKenna demanded. "For confirmed," Dalton replied, already scanning for the next target. "At least 4 more out there." With that, McKenna gestured at the scrap rifle, his voice incredulous. Dalton didn't answer. He'd found the 5th target. Ground floor, center building, firing from behind an overturned cart. The sniper was good, disciplined, moving between shots, never staying in one spot long enough to draw fire. But Dalton had been watching patterns, tracking movement, predicting where the shooter would appear next. He aimed at the left side of the cart, where the sniper had popped up twice already. He waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then the helmet appeared, followed by the rifle barrel, and Dalton fired before the sniper could line up his shot. The helmet snapped back, and the rifle clattered to the ground. 5 down. The night had become a deadly chess game, and Jimmy Dalton was 3 moves ahead of every opponent, while the rest of 3rd Platoon hunkered behind cover. Trying to survive, Dalton had turned the ambush inside out. The hunters were becoming the hunted, and they didn't even realize it yet. His scrap rifle, the joke, the insult, the $5 piece of junk, was doing what no standard-issue weapon in the platoon had managed to do. It was turning the tide. 6th target, far left flank, dug into a crater, elevated position with a clear view of the road. This sniper had been quiet for the last minute, probably repositioning or waiting for platoon to make a move. Dalton studied the terrain, calculated angles, and spotted a faint shimmer of movement near the crater's edge. Moonlight reflecting off a rifle scope. Tiny, almost invisible, but enough. He aimed 2 feet below the shimmer, where the sniper's head would be if he was prone and aiming downward. He fired. The scrap rifle bucked. The bolt ejected the casing with metallic clink, and across the darkness, the shimmer disappeared. No movement, no follow-up shots. 6 down. Jesus Christ, someone muttered nearby. a private named Kowalski who'd spent the last 10 minutes convinced he was going to die in this nameless French village. He's killing all of them. Not all, Dalton said quietly, eyes still scanning. 2 more, maybe 3. McKenna had stopped trying to direct a platoon and was now just watching Dalton work. His expression, a mixture of shock and something close to reverence. This was beyond marksmanship. This was art. This was a man who understood rifles the way some men understood music or mathematics, who could read wind and distance and angles in the dark, who could build a weapon from scrap and use it to dismantle an ambush that should have killed them all. 7th target. This one was smart. Too smart. He hadn't fired in over 2 minutes, hadn't given away his position, was probably waiting for Dalton to expose himself while searching for targets. Dalton knew the feeling, the discipline of staying hidden, trusting that patience would outlast aggression. But patience was a two-way game. Dalton shifted position, crawling 10 feet to his right, using the rubble for cover, changing his angle of observation. From this new position, he could see a section of rooftop that had been hidden before, and there, barely visible, was the outline of a rifle barrel protruding from behind a chimney stack. The sniper was good. He'd chosen position with excellent cover and a wide field of fire. But he'd made one mistake. He'd stayed in the same spot too long. Dalton couldn't see the man himself, only the rifle. But rifles don't float in midair. He aimed at the base of the chimney, where a prone shooter would have to position his body to brace the weapon. He adjusted for the extreme angle, the distance, nearly 170 yards, and the fact that he was shooting at a target he couldn't actually see, only infer. He fired. The scrap rifle roared. The bullet crossed the distance and struck stone, and Dalton thought for a second that he'd missed. But then the rifle barrel jerked upward and clattered onto the roof tiles, and a figure rolled out from behind the chimney, clutching aside, and went still. 7 down. The incoming fire had stopped entirely now. The night was silent except for the ragged breathing of 30 terrified men who couldn't quite believe they were still alive. McKenna rose cautiously from cover, rifle up, scanning the ruins. Cease fire. Cease fire. Check your sectors. He turned to Dalton, who was calmly reloading his rifle, fingers working the mechanism with practiced ease. How many is that? 7 confirmed, Dalton said. Might be 1 more. Might not. You got 7 enemy snipers with that thing. Larson's voice was high-pitched, disbelieving, like a kid who just watched a magic trick and couldn't figure out the secret. Dalton didn't look at him. His eyes were still on the rooftops, the windows, the shadows. They're not snipers if they're dead, he said flatly. They're just targets. McKenna let out a long, shaky breath and laughed, a sound that was equal parts relief and hysteria. You magnificent crazy hillbilly. You just saved the whole damn platoon with a rifle made from garbage. It's not garbage, Dalton replied, finally lowering his weapon. It's a tool. Tools work if you know how to use them. But he wasn't done yet. Something was nagging at him, a sense that the math didn't add up. 7 snipers was a lot, but the ambush had felt bigger, more coordinated. There should be 1 more. Maybe 2. He scanned the ruins again, slower this time, looking not for movement but for absence. Places where shadows were too deep, angles that didn't quite match the terrain. And then he saw it. A flicker of movement behind a pile of sandbags near the entrance to the village square, a position that would have been perfect for overwatch, for a commander or spotter coordinating the ambush. The figure was barely visible, crouched low, probably trying to retreat now that the ambush had collapsed. Dalton didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, found the target through his makeshift sight, and fired. 8! The figure dropped behind the sandbags and didn't move again. Dalton worked the bolt, ejecting the final spent casing, and let the rifle rest across his lap. His hands were steady. His breathing was calm. He felt the exhaustion now, the adrenaline starting to fade, leaving behind the hollow awareness of what he'd just done. 8 men, 8 lives ended in less than 10 minutes. He didn't feel pride, didn't feel guilt, just a cold acknowledgement that this was war, and tonight he'd been better at it than the enemy. McKenna walked over and crouched beside him, staring at the scrap rifle like it was a holy relic. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. We all do. Dalton shook his head. You don't owe me anything. I did my job. Your job. McKenna laughed again, softer this time. Your job was to carry a rifle and shoot when ordered. You just single-handedly broke an ambush that should have killed half the platoon. That's not a job. That's a miracle. Word spread fast. By the time 3rd Platoon regrouped and secured the village perimeter at dawn, every man in Charlie Company had heard the story. Dalton and his scrap rifle. 8 snipers. One night, the same soldiers who'd spent weeks mocking him, calling his weapon a joke, were now crowding around him, asking questions, wanting to see the rifle, wanting to know how he'd done it. The jokes had vanished, replaced by something closer to reverence. Larson was the first to ask, "Can you build me one?" His voice was earnest, almost pleading. I mean, not exactly like yours, but something that works like that. Dalton looked at him, surprised. You've got a perfectly good M1. I know, but Larson struggled to find the words. I want something like yours. Something I can trust. You can trust your M1, Dalton said patiently. It's a fine rifle. Better than mine, actually, if we're being honest. Mine just fits me. That's the difference. But Larson wasn't the only one. Over the next hour, half a dozen men approached Dalton with the same request. They wanted him to build them custom rifles, modify their weapons, teach them his secrets. Some offered money. Some offered cigarettes, rations, anything they had. McKenna had to step in and shut it down before it turned into a mob scene. Dalton's not running a workshop, McKenna announced, his voice carrying authority and a hint of amusement. He's a rifleman, not a gunsmith. You want a better weapon. Take care of the one you've got. But privately. McKenna pulled Dalton aside as the platoon dug in around the village, and the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. They stood on the edge of the square, near the sandbags where Dalton had dropped the 8 sniper. The body had already been removed, but the bloodstain was still there, dark and fresh. That thing you did last night, McKenna said, his voice low and serious. That wasn't luck. That wasn't just good shooting. That was something else. Dalton shrugged. I grew up shooting. My daddy taught me. That's all. No, McKenna insisted. I've seen good shooters. Hell, I've seen great shooters. What you did was beyond that. You read that ambush like a book. You found targets nobody else could see. You dropped 8 trained snipers in the dark with a rifle you built from spare parts. That's not normal. Dalton met his gaze, his gray eyes calm and unreadable. Maybe normal's overrated. McKenna smiled, a tired, genuine smile. Yeah, maybe it is. He clapped Dalton on the shoulder. Whatever that rifle is, whatever you did to it, it saved lives last night. My life included. So thank you. Dalton nodded, uncomfortable with the praise, but accepting it, just doing what needed doing. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the ruined village, the platoon settled into defensive positions and tried to catch a few hours of sleep. Dalton found a quiet corner in a half-collapsed barn, set his scrap rifle beside him, and closed his eyes. He was exhausted, bone-deep tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fully cure. But there was a satisfaction, too, a quiet knowledge that he'd proven something important. Not to his squad mates, not to McKenna, but to himself. The rifle worked. Not because it was pretty or regulation or approved by some distant authority, but because he built it to work, because he understood it, because he'd put in the hours and the sweat and the care to make an extension of himself. That was the secret nobody else seemed to understand. A weapon wasn't just metal and wood. It was a relationship. It was trust, and trust had to be earned. By mid-morning, runners arrived from battalion headquarters with new orders. The advance would continue. 3rd Platoon had taken casualties, but remained combat effective. They'd push on to the next objective within the hour. As the men roused themselves and prepared to move out, Dalton checked his rifle one final time. The stock was still mismatched. The barrel was still salvaged. The sight was still homemade. But it had done its job, and it would do its job again for as long as he needed it to. Larson approached him as they formed up, helmet strapped tight, rifle slung over his shoulder. "Hey, Dalton," he said, awkward and sincere. "I'm sorry. For the jokes." for calling it junk. I didn't understand. Dalton looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. It's all right. You understand now. That's what matters. Can I ask you something? Larson hesitated. How did you know? How did you see them when nobody else could? Dalton thought about it, trying to find the right words. I didn't see them, he said finally. I saw where they had to be. There's a difference. You look for the man, you'll miss him half the time. You look for the logic, the geometry, the places where a smart shooter would hide. That's where you find them. Larson nodded slowly, processing this. That makes sense. I think. You'll figure out, Dalton said. Just takes practice. The platoon moved out, leaving the village behind, marching east into a landscape of broken towns and frozen fields. The war wasn't over. The danger wasn't past. But something had changed in 3rd Platoon that night. They'd seen what was possible when a man truly knew his weapon, when skill and improvisation and raw determination came together. They'd seen the $5 scrap rifle, once a joke, once an insult, become a legend, and Jimmy Dalton, the quiet hillbilly from West Virginia who'd rebuilt a broken rifle with spare parts and stubbornness, had become something more than just another rifleman. He'd become a man you wanted beside you when a night turned deadly, and the enemy had you pinned, and survival came down to one perfect shot in the darkness. The rifle wasn't special, but the man behind it was, and that, in the end, made all the difference.